Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilbert, coming to you from Baltimore. The UK's Minister of International Development, Priti Patel, was forced to resign this week due to allegations concerning a trip to Israel. During her trip, she held a series of meetings without informing the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is doubtful that the story of Patel's secret trip to Israel would have been such a scandal if not for an Al Jazeera documentary called The Lobby, which exposes Israel's attempts to influence British policy towards Israel by infiltrating British political organizations. Here's a short clip from the documentary.
We're also looking for somebody to work on the whole BDS piece, doing research into the different BDS movements, who they are, what they are, a little bit of strategy on that whole piece. So I don't know if either of those things might appeal to you.
Ella Rose, the new director of the Jewish labor movement, was pleased to hear of Robin's plans to set up a young LFI.
I used to work at the embassy here. I can definitely help you out.
Okay.
Would love to come to any and every event you're hosting. Please consider me your #1 fan.
The guest of honor, a minister from the Israeli government.
I grew up on the ideology that the land of Israel totally belongs to the Jewish people, not any compromise, morally, biblically. The land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people.
Minister Gilad Erdan happens to be one of the people with which Minister Priti Patel met during her trip to Israel. Joining me to analyze what all of this means is Rivka Bernard. Rivka is the Senior Global Justice Campaign Officer and Senior Campaigner on Militarism and Security at War and Want. Thanks for joining us today, Rivka.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start about having you tell us about Priti Patel and her positions on Israel and British politics in general.
Sure. Okay, so until Wednesday, when she was forced to resign, Priti Patel was the Secretary of State for International Development. So that means she was responsible for the UK's overseas development and UK foreign aid projects. She's considered on the right of the Conservative Party here in the UK. She's an outspoken supporter of Israel and also other regimes like India's repressive regime under Modi. She was formerly a tobacco lobbyist. And one of her sort of campaigns has been to cut or to examine and potentially cut the UK's aid package to the Palestinian territories, to the occupied Palestinian territories. So her support for Israel is also sort of motivated by a real antagonism towards Palestinians.
So why did Patel go on this trip to Israel, and who did she meet with, and why did you think she kept it a secret?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it was when it first emerged, she said that it was a family holiday, a family vacation. But when the itinerary was exposed, it was clear that she was meeting numbers of Israeli officials, including the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is an unusual meeting to have on a family holiday. And like you said, she hadn't disclosed it to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is protocol. The interesting thing about this is that her itinerary was pretty much identical to the itinerary that a lot of British MPs take, usually arranged by a lobby group called the Conservative Friends of Israel. And a prominent lobbyist called Lord Pollock was also accompanying her on many of the meetings. So it looks like he had set up some of the meetings for her, and she was kind of working to strengthen her personal relationships with these Israeli officials that were only more than happy to welcome her and to meet with her. You mentioned that she met with Israel's an official called Gilad Erdan, who heads up Israel's anti-BDS task force. That meeting was actually in London a few weeks after she came back. So there was another set of undisclosed meetings that happened here in London, actually, that included the meeting with him.
So the main issue for which the Labour Party criticized Patel regarding this trip is not for her complicity with Israeli occupation or apartheid policies, but the fact that such a trip makes her vulnerable to blackmail and can be exploited for espionage purposes. What do you think this means? Who could exert pressure on her and how?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't actually think it's an issue of anyone exerting pressure on her. I think what her trip sort of exposes is something not just about her, but that's actually quite common in the UK government and governments like in the US as well, which is a very, very close relationship between the UK government and the Israeli government. So again, it's actually not just her that goes on these meetings. She was just exposed for it because she didn't disclose it. I think there's a shared agenda actually between Israel's highly repressive government and certain political figures in the UK, and certainly her trip sort of brings some of this to light. And I'm keen to make sure that actually, even though she's resigned now, which was the absolute right thing to happen, we need to keep looking at the UK relationships with Israel and in a more structural way. It's not just about person-to-person relationships or influence one way or another. It's about an ongoing relationship that's structured by things like the arms trade, for example.
Well, that's actually the next point I wanted to get to, which is that Clayton Swisher of Middle East Eye believes that the Patel incident demonstrates how the image of the State of Israel has changed in Britain. To use his words, it is no longer true that playing the Israel card in domestic politics is a guaranteed bet. Do you agree with this statement of his, and do cases like this also help bring forward the plight of Palestinians to the attention of the general British public?
Well, I think one thing that's sure is that that it's becoming more and more apparent that there's a problem with the UK's relationship with Israel's repressive regime. And I think the Israeli government itself is actually playing a big role in exposing itself in some ways because of how intensely repressive it's become in the past few years. Of course, its policies have always been the same, its policies of occupation and continued colonization. But the measures that the current Israeli regime have taken, the crackdown on human rights defenders, have really exposed itself. And I think there's a high level of skepticism amongst the British public and increasingly amongst some British politicians also, that there's a problem with this relationship, that the UK government shouldn't be spending time getting closer to repressive regimes. It should be using its own pressure to hold them to account.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now. I was speaking to Rivka Bernard, Senior Global Justice Campaign Officer at War and Want. Thanks again, Rivka, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.